Rotonda finale del convegno, l'abbiamo intitolata Cultura, Visuale e Storia Contemporanea, ai diversi partecipanti di interpretare in qualche modo questo titolo. Procederei come da programma, secondo l'elenco appunto che è previsto nel programma stesso, quindi Alberto Banti, poi Piero Brunetta, poi Clark, Ilaria Porciani, Ludmilla Jordanova e Vanessa Schwartz. Quindi riprendiamo, abbiamo di nuovo i nostri keynote e alcuni dei discussant del convegno. Lascerei 10 minuti a testa per il primo giro e poi eventualmente un secondo giro di interventi. Quindi do subito la parola ad Alberto Banti.
Grazie, ma penso che Carlotta, Elena, Federico, Margherita hanno organizzato un convegno coi fiocchi, bisogna dirlo, ricchissimo di stimoli, ricchissimo di suggestioni. Però devo anche dire che io qui a questo tavolo ovviamente sono un outsider, perché occasionalmente ho usato fonti visuali e allora questo spiega perché io ho solo domande da porre o incertezze o richieste d'aiuto da fare, non considerazioni conclusive o osservazioni generali. Un primo punto riguarda il rapporto fra interpretazione e ricezione. È già stato posto il problema da Simona Troio, ma lo riprendo sulla base dell'intervento di Timothy Clark, che abbiamo detto tutti è stato un bellissimo intervento. Però io mi chiedo, che cosa volevi fare esattamente? Cioè, quando hai presentato la lettura del cubismo come un movimento nostalgico, rivolto verso il passato, attento agli interni borghesi, qual era la tua intenzione, il tuo programma? Cercare l'essenza ontologica del cubismo, forse? Vedere una cosa che nessuno prima aveva visto mai e farcela vedere e farcela capire a tutti quanti, cioè trovare la verità, una verità nascosta del cubismo, forse. Questa è una dimensione dell'interpretazione perfettamente legittima. Però io ho la sensazione che se si va a vedere la lettura che del cubismo viene data dai collezionisti o dai contemporanei di Picasso all'inizio del XX secolo, troviamo delle risposte diverse, delle risposte che collocano piuttosto unilateralmente il cubismo in una dimensione di un modernismo rivolto al futuro, o come un'operazione linguistica che fa esplodere, che non è anti-nostalgica, anticlassica. Ammettiamo che sia così, io non sono uno storico dell'arte, non conosco il cubismo, magari ho appena detto la stupidaggine di mezzogiorno e un quarto, ma se è così si pone un problema. Cosa dobbiamo cercare come storici? La dimensione storica della ricezione o la verità ontologica degli oggetti che stiamo studiando? O sono due livelli diversi della verità? O due livelli non conciliabili, mai conciliabili della verità? Che dobbiamo fare? Cercare appunto ciò che è nascosto, il noumeno dei fatti visivi, per esempio, cioè l'essenza ontologica profonda. O è più importante la dimensione storica della ricezione, all'inizio del XX secolo o dopo? Io non lo so, davvero non lo so. Magari è un problema che pure mi sono posto, ma chiedo non solo a Clark, la sua bellissima lezione come un esempio, ma si potrebbe fare la stessa osservazione per molte altre relazioni, quindi lo chiedo in generale. Seconda questione. Che ci dobbiamo fare con tutta questa valanga di immagini che abbiamo visto? Che ne dovessimo vedere una valanga era ovvio, posto il convegno. Immagini, icone, pitture, fotografie, clip, una quantità incredibile di immagini. Che ci dobbiamo fare? Cioè, che strategie di lettura dobbiamo prendere? In qualche caso, ascoltando molte relazioni, ho avuto la sensazione che il sottotesto teorico suggerisse che si possono immaginare che si possono pensare queste immagini come disposte in un unico possibile network di relazioni intertestuali universale che le collega tutte, magari con passaggi difficili o non diretti, ci sono relazioni più dirette, relazioni più blande, però una specie di unico virtuale rete di relazioni intertestuali. E qualche volta ho pensato che si potrebbe anche immaginare una realizzazione di un Atlante alla Warburg che tenga tutti insieme, non nel senso che qualcuno sia mai in grado di farlo, perché nessuno sarà mai in grado di farlo, ma come prospettiva teorica tutte queste immagini rimbalzano su tutte le altre. Se è così, siamo legittimati a parlare di una società dello sguardo. Magari cambia, ci sono ricorrenze, magari tra 1820 e 1840 ci sono dei temi che si impongono, o dei media che si impongono, nel 1920-30 ce ne sono altri, ma è come se fosse un corpo compatto che si muove in simultanea. Ma in altri casi ho avuto la sensazione che si debba accettare, che si debba prendere una prospettiva completamente diversa, che non si deve pensare che c'è un network universale di rapporti intertestuali fra tutte le possibili immagini, ma che ci sono degli addensamenti a gruppi, a costellazioni. Ci sono delle aree in cui le immagini stanno in rapporto stretto fra loro e blandissimo con altri tipi di immagini. Se è così non dovremmo parlare di una società dello sguardo, ma di molte simultanee società dello sguardo. E la mia sensazione è che la molteplicità possibile non dipenda tanto dalla diversità di chi produce le immagini, uno fa il pittore, insomma uno è orientato ideologicamente in un modo, stilisticamente in un altro, né sia dettata dai temi che si affrontano. A volte ho avuto la sensazione che sono i media che impongono il proprio archivio iconologico. E se uno sceglie di fare dei disegni sul corpo di una persona, sta dentro un archivio iconologico specifico che gli consente di utilizzare delle immagini, ma gliene lega altre. Se uno fa i manifesti elettorali, stessa operazione, ha delle interazioni, un dialogo che apre con altri media e altri set di immagini, ma non dialoga con altre cose ancora. Ho avuto la sensazione che la scelta del medium si porta dietro un archivio iconologico specifico e impone delle costrizioni. Naturalmente nessuna costrizione di questo tipo è invalicabile e immagino che la storia delle esperienze visuali sia, non immagino, sappiamo tutti che è fatta di rotture, sconfinamenti, sovrapposizioni, però anche di rigidità. Se io adesso come spettatore leggo una graphic novel, sfoglio una rivista di moda, o guardo un film di fantascienza, o guardo una sitcom alla televisione, sto dentro diversi repertori iconologici, iconografici, che non mi sembra dialoghino necessariamente fra loro. Ma non lo so, veramente, io davvero dichiaro il mio essere outsider come un punto fondamentale in questo. Davvero vi chiederei a tutti voi che siete infinitamente più esperti un aiuto. Mi sembra un punto interessante da discutere, per questo ve lo propongo e se qualcuno mi aiuta a capire qualcosa intorno a questo punto, bene, ne sarò veramente molto molto grato. Grazie.
Bene, allora abbiamo cominciato subito entrando bene nel merito e anche, come dire, con delle domande grosse. Allora cedo la parola a Gian Piero Brunetta, anzi per questo.
Sì, io potrei avventurarmi in una prima risposta a domande grosse di Alberto Banti, anche perché ho cercato di affrontare questi problemi in modo progressivo. I miei lavori sulla sulla storia del cinema da quando ho cominciato a occuparmi dello spettatore e della storia della visione popolare, cioè 30 anni fa circa. E a partire da quel momento, ma anche prima, con l'amicizia di alcuni storici contemporaneisti padovani, abbiamo dialogato sulle fonti da usare nelle nostre rispettive discipline e sulla necessità di allargare gli orizzonti delle fonti. E allora, anche se sono parte del cast che ha pensato questo convegno, devo dire che credo importante questo convegno per gli storici, per l'allargamento di prospettive che propone, per il tipo di nodi e archi che cerca di stabilire tra competenze diverse, appunto guardando a grandi scenari, non solo all'iconosfera insomma infinita, anche forse se lo consideriamo non un punto d'arrivo ma un punto di passaggio, un punto che apre altre strade. Credo che sia giusto non rispondere anche agli interrogativi immediatamente, ma considerare appunto questo un punto importante che sollecita delle interazioni molto ampie. Non ultima quella che è venuta fuori da una delle domande di questa mattina, il problema delle comparazioni, della storia comparata. Occupandomi di cinema e anche solo di cinema italiano, ho avuto subito a che fare con questi problemi, perché il cinema italiano ha una sua natura, ma per esempio negli anni 30 è cinema americano. E l'immaginario degli italiani è formato dal cinema americano per molti anni, fino al 38. In questo periodo ho proprio fatto un lavoro, ricollegandomi ai miei lavori precedenti, in cui ho cercato di studiare la nascita dell'advertising americano, delle grandi majors, e come le strategie con cui si sono mossi in Italia, e vedendo come la massa di materiali che proponevano di tipo visuale, che precedevano la visione vera e propria del film, fosse a copertura totale del territorio, tutti gli spazi possibili. C'erano proprio delle strategie che erano raccontate in queste broschurine, in cui a partire da affermazioni come, non so, ve ne leggo una sola, insomma, l'isola del tesoro: mai prima d'ora il cinema, non solo in Italia ma neppure in Europa, ha organizzato campagne di stampa di questa portata. Un documento della sua importanza lo fornisce la stessa autorizzazione necessaria dei competenti organi della Federazione Fascista dello Spettacolo. A seguito della vasta pubblicità preliminare svolta nei precedenti mesi, inizia la programmazione nel cinema d'Italia e in tutti i più importanti quotidiani un bombardamento di stampa che arriverà in tutti i centri grandi e piccoli. Ma non bastasse questo, si prevede quanti giorni prima si debba partire, come devono essere graduati i manifesti, tutti i posti fino all'ultima sala o libreria o negozio di moda in cui vanno collocati dei messaggi visivi. Quindi si crea una sorta, proprio pensando agli interventi sul turismo, sul sguardo dello spettatore, di serendipity oriented. Lo spettatore crede di muoversi nella città, però è tutto previsto e controllato e deve vedere quelle cose. faccio vedere per esempio a un certo punto vengono creati anche dei falsi giornali, delle edizioni, come per il lancio di San Francisco si fa un quotidiano distribuito in 500.000 copie che racconta, lancia il film San Francisco. Io ho cercato di vedere questo lavoro, da una parte questa strategia generale, dall'altra avvicinarmi allo sguardo dello spettatore, cercando di utilizzare in modo rapinoso, diciamo, le ricerche del professor Izzolati sui neuroni specchio. Allora, come interrogarsi sulle emozioni dello spettatore avvicinandosi il più possibile allo spettatore comune? C'è tutta una tradizione, le fonti letterarie sono molto buone, ma ci sono i giornali popolari, le lettere ai giornali delle spettatrici che raccontano, appunto, ho scelto solo i baci e il pianto come cosa, ma sui baci c'è una letteratura di anonime spettatrici che ti trasmettono le loro emozioni. Per un bacio di Rodolfo Valentino potrei anche morire. Do un solo esempio. Io non ho altro da dire a questo punto, vorrei però farvi vedere una cosa che ho fatto proprio in anteprima qui, un cattivo esempio di lavoro storico, però il lavoro storico che usa la fonte storica per parlare a pubblici sconosciuti. Qua il pubblico che avremo davanti è un pubblico di 1 milione di cinesi. È un lavoro che abbiamo finito ieri e quindi ve lo mostro. Sono 4 video, ve ne faccio vedere uno solo in cui cerchiamo di raccontare la storia Italia in 5 minuti, tutta la storia Italia in 5 minuti. Il modello è Marc Ferro in qualche modo, e con 4 video e 250 pezzi di film raccontiamo la bellezza dell'Italia, bellezza storica, bellezza delle sue attrici, bellezza del paesaggio, bellezza delle città. Ecco. È un modo appunto di fare la storia, io lo considero abbastanza legittimo. Un attimo prima. Posso andare? Sì, sì. Sono sciabolate di millenni in un secondo, e tenete conto, appunto, ci siamo posti che cosa sappiano i cinesi della nostra storia, cioè niente. Quindi questi sono i dati di partenza.
Ci può dire chi è il committente?
Il committente è l'Expo di Shanghai. L'Expo di Shanghai, la produzione è la Triennale di Milano, 4 filmati, abbiamo una stanza molto grande appunto in cui dobbiamo tenere presente che ogni giorno, dura un anno, passano 4.000-5.000 persone. Passano 4.000-5.000 persone che non sanno nulla dell'Italia, però in ogni momento della loro visione, sia che vedano le attrici, sia che vedano, devono avere qualcosa di riconoscibile in qualche modo, per cui avete visto il disseminato, ci sono delle cose che non sai cosa siano, ma non lo sappiamo neanche noi in qualche modo, però solo film, immagini memorabili e meno conosciute, insomma la somma di tutti è la bellezza, l'orgoglio, quindi bandiere in questo, insomma, e poi grandi attrici, grandi monumenti e grandi paesaggi in quadro. E anche, sì, cioè i segni della storia li abbiamo, sì. Come avete visto era difficile fare gli ultimi 30 anni qui, quindi abbiamo liquidati rapidamente e li abbiamo messo negli altri un po' di più.
Bene, grazie Gianpiero. Allora, sempre più mi pare che si vada configurando il fatto che questa tavola rotonda doveva forse intitolarsi in un altro modo, cioè c'è un elemento in più, cioè diciamo cultura visuale, storia contemporanea e media studies, no? Forse questo è un panorama un po' più corretto di quello che si va configurando. Do allora la parola a Timothy Clark.
Yeah, very hard to follow that film actually. I mean, especially for someone like me who was brought up on the golden age of Italian post-war cinema and the great myth of Italian history that cinema embodied. Yeah, so I mean, actually it's a very interesting moment to have this conference, of course, in Italy, isn't it, where you are, I think, at a moment where you have the possibility, perhaps, of recovering from a quarter of a century of dictatorship of the image and image politics. So it's a very apposite moment, I think, for this conference. That being said, I suppose I have to sort of steer back to, banal academic questions, but, which I will. And I'm faced with a little bit of a choice. I could immediately respond to Alberto's questions, which are wonderful and profoundly difficult. I think I'll just take a slightly different tactic and speak a little more generally, but in the hope that in the end it provides some elements of an answer. One of the things that I've been struck, I mean, it's an extraordinary conference, and above all I am, deeply impressed by the seriousness of the engagement of historians with the image world. There was a point at which, and Vanessa and Ludmilla will remember this very vividly, where there was a certain resentment on the part of art historians about the invasion of historians into their territory, and a certain impatience with, shall we say, a sort of anecdotal and additive use of the image to, add a little glamour to the work of history. That moment has passed, and there is a sort of profound struggle going on, I think, with the question of how we think historically about the image and how the image world enables us to think historically more profoundly. That's great. That's absolutely great. So that leads me to just, there's so much that I could talk about, but I think I want to just talk about one difficult authority that has been invoked repeatedly here. And we all invoke authorities. I'm a Walter Benjaminian through and through, as should be, I hope, was clear from my talk. But I think it's inevitable that we invoke authorities, that we try to give our reflection a theoretical shape, and we lean on previous thought, previous theoretical achievement. And let's just be aware of how peculiar some of our authorities are, how very special their claims, how very extraordinary their procedures are. I could talk at length about Foucault apropos of this, right, who has also been another continually invoked authority, but as Benjamin is much closer to me, and in talking about him, it's an autocritique. I think I'll do that. So maybe two questions. What is Benjamin claiming for the image? What is it he thinks that images from the past can do for us as historical subjects, and as political actors, but right, for him the two always go together. Secondly, how does he think that the image and its meaning becomes available to us as critics, as historians? What is it we do in order to open the image to full historical cognizance, full historical availability to us? And I just simply want to say, this again is me struggling with my own relationship to this extraordinarily powerful example. I just want to say, just be aware of first of all, the historical location of Benjamin's own project in the 1920s and 30s. His deep immersion in the crisis of interwar Europe, his Marxism, his struggle with Marxism, his extraordinary hope for the end of bourgeois society. All right? I mean, that underlies all this. So what's he claiming? What is a dialectical image in his view? A dialectical image is an image that persists, waits to reveal itself in some future present. Because in it, the dialectics of bourgeois capitalist civilization stopped, were held at some kind of standstill in the 19th century. The immense potentials of bourgeois capitalist urbanism were there, but profoundly unrealized. And they produced a range of social formations, and particularly a range of image worlds, in which that bulk, stalemated potential was frozen in the form of an image. And it is, of course, I mean, here's his absolutely Marxist presupposition. That frozen potential lives on. It's always there, bubbling under the surface of a frozen bourgeois society. And therefore, these images in which that potential and its freezing lives on, they live on for us. They have the potential for leaping out of the past. Remember his absolute contempt for what he called empathy. History. The idea that the historian goes back into the past and empathizes with it. That's exactly not his image of the historian's task. The historian is waiting for the present to leap into his or her present. Extraordinary dialectical, I'm tempted to say myth. But of course I say myth as someone who believes profoundly in myth. It's not a pejorative. But I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that this Benjamin's view of the image and its afterlife and its possible historical being for us in the present comes out of the most extraordinary set of metaphysical and political beliefs, commitments, presuppositions. I mean, I happen to share some of them. But I guess I'm just saying to you, I wonder, I think we all have to confront the issue of what do we take on when we take on Benjamin? We take on a certain extraordinary Marxist-inflected vision of historical continuities, discontinuities, afterlives. The only other thing, the second thing I want to say, we'll hopefully come back to these issues. And this is tremendously relevant to anyone doing historical work on the image. Because after all, very few of us are going to somehow or other enter a time capsule in which we rediscover Marxist hope in 1924 and 1926, right? You know, we're not going to go back into Benjamin's historical ideological shoes, but we still are going to somehow or other want to learn from him. And I think one of the things we can learn from him is this extraordinary proposal that comes down to us in the form of the Arcades project about what does it take then to retrieve the image from the past and fully grasp its historical significance. And I would suggest two things. I mean, very obvious suggestions, but just worth reiterating. Well, look at it, the Arcades project. It's an absolutely bizarre conglomerate of immense, endless, you know, what Freud might say, analysis interminable, right? Endless, interminable immersion, empirical immersion in 19th century Paris. But always an empirical immersion which is waiting for the moment of intuition. Waiting for the moment in which the dialectical image declares itself and its meaning. Right? And that sometimes doesn't happen, by the way. All right? I mean, just look at the convent, look at the part of the Arcades project, which is about one of the giant figures of visual culture in 19th century France. In my view, maybe the giant, Honoré Daumier. A perfect example for us as art historians, right? Because he's a very, very great artist, in my view, but working, you know, is he an artist? Well, he's certainly working in the field of visual culture. He's not a high artist, although he had ambitions behind him. So, the perfect example. Benjamin's study of Daumier utterly peters out. It comes to nothing. And I would say, or you know, it's actually to do with Benjamin's profound limitations as a looker at images. Actually, right? Adorno, in his letters to Benjamin, is much more brilliant about Daumier, actually, than poor old Benjamin ever managed to be. And these are just thrown off letters. The intuition doesn't happen. He can't work with this. The accumulative empirical immersion doesn't get to the moment in which things constellate. And he sees the image. He gets it in a frame. He begins to understand it. The contrary example of the success of the Benjaminian method, if you could talk about it as a method at all, is the immense convolute on Baudelaire. Well, of course, he's far more at home with Baudelaire because he's essentially a literary gentleman, you know. Far more at home with Baudelaire, and the convolute is an immense accumulation of, this comes back a little, Alberto, to your question, an immense accumulation of contemporary reaction, which for months and months, seemingly year after year, maybe years, seems to get it nowhere. You're always waiting for that moment in the notes where Benjamin speaks, and he gets a hold of his material and speaks in his own voice about the object. And you have to wait. You have to wait endlessly in the Baudelaire convolute. It's only in the last 2 or 3 pages of like 40, 50 pages of congealed contemporary stuff, right? Historical material, that you finally, you can see him finally seeing Baudelaire, right? Seeing things about Baudelaire's imagery, Baudelaire's diction, which enable him somehow or other to make use of his material. Well, that's basically enough. I'm just look, I worship Benjamin, as you will gather, but just be aware of what it is you're worshipping in worshipping Benjamin, right? You're worshipping one of the most demanding and eccentric proposals about what is involved in writing the history of imagery. That's not an instruction to not go to him. On the contrary, it's just an instruction to, wow, you're going to something whose demands on you are immense.
Grazie. Grazie a Timothy Clark, passo subito la parola a Ilaria Porciani.
Molto difficile prendere la parola dopo questa forza delle immagini, Brunetta, suggerimenti profondi di Clark. Ne darete atto. Ieri sera Tim Clark ci ha chiesto a cena che cosa avevamo davvero imparato da questo convegno, molto bello, molto ricco, molto ben organizzato e del quale siamo tutti molto grati. E allora io ci ho pensato un po' su e ho capito che per me l'acquisizione più grande è stata una nuova consapevolezza sul lavoro che ho fatto negli ultimi 8 anni e attraverso questa consapevolezza quindi l'idea di sviluppare ancora di più in direzione dello sguardo, dell'uso delle immagini, una fase successiva del lavoro che è ancora da compiere. Quindi farò un intervento in qualche modo autobiografico che spero che accogliate come espressione di sincerità e di autobiografismo fine a se stesso. Avevo iniziato a occuparmi di storia della storiografia una quindicina di anni fa cercando di porre al centro che era stato ai margini, dando voce e presenza appunto alle donne nella storia della storiografia e facendo così anche un contributo che tra l'altro è open access, che è il risultato di un programma a cui hanno contribuito alcune delle persone che sono qui. Avevo sottolineato l'esigenza di guardare anche alla rappresentazione dei corpi delle storiche, usando anche fonti di tipo letterario, ivi compreso libri gialli, libri polizieschi, tra cui quelli di P.D. James. E avevo usato in quell'occasione un'icona per introdurre il discorso sulla storia, un ritratto probabilmente di Marco Foscarini, un ritratto bifronte in cui lo storico, insomma l'uomo comunque politico, è rappresentato come una figura maschile che però nel retro è una figura femminile, l'icona della storiografia. E avevo giocato molto anche sull'analogia tra le donne autrici di pittura di storia e le donne autrici di storia, a cominciare dalla scuola di David. Perché faccio riferimento a questo? Perché ho cercato, credo da allora, di introdurre le immagini e la riflessione sulle immagini come un utile strumento analitico, non come illustrazione, come utile strumento analitico dentro un settore che fino a quel momento, mi sembra almeno, è stato totalmente, quasi totalmente, diciamo per prudenza, un settore assolutamente aniconico, quello della storia della storiografia, che si è concentrato sulle parole, la parola scritta, e che solo appunto in modo molto episodico ha usato anche la fonte iconografica, quasi non l'ho usata per niente. Perciò proprio per questo quando ho cominciato a fare questo discorso ho cominciato a elaborare un grosso lavoro di Atlante della storiografia europea di 2 secoli di riflessione sulla professione storica europea, ho cercato di usare appunto le immagini come strumento analitico, la mappa geografica to put on the map, cioè inserire al centro del discorso quello che era eccentrico o ignorato, i paesi piccoli, le storiografie minori e così via, i soggetti meno centrali del discorso, e anche per comparare. Quindi l'uso nella storia della storiografia della mappa come strumento utile non di illustrazione, ma di analisi, strumento costitutivo della conoscenza e di comparazione, perché in nessun luogo come in una mappa si vedono bene i piani vuoti, si vedono bene le disparità tra le quantità che fanno una differenza. E poi anche l'uso delle immagini. In tutta la prima parte di questo canto della storiografia europea abbiamo usato immagini, fotografie, carte de visite di storici, fotografie di gruppi di storici in vari paesi, in vari contesti, fotografie dei luoghi e degli spazi, sviluppando un utile suggerimento che veniva da Bonnie Smith di far vedere lo spazio del seminario, per far capire quali erano gli spazi che segnavano l'elemento dialogico della conoscenza e quindi che cambiavano qualcosa nella trasmissione, nella produzione di storie. Ecco, se devo dire che cosa ho imparato qui è stato a rimettere a fuoco in che modo davvero, a volte un po' inconsciamente abbiamo fatto questa cosa, e come al momento in cui andremo a mettere sul web tutto questo lavoro, passando dal lavoro che è stato già pubblicato al web, avremo da imparare appunto da tutto questo e anche dal modo in cui poi Massimo Riva ha fatto un lavoro del genere con il panorama Garibaldi, per sviluppare proprio l'uso euristico delle immagini. Grazie.
Grazie Ilaria. Ludmilla.
Thank you. Well, I've learned an enormous amount, and about so many things. So thank you. Okay, I'm going to tackle my little SWOT a bit differently. The title of the roundtable is Visual Culture and Modern History. So I'm going to try and take on that challenge. So, visual culture. I think we just simply have to accept that the category visual culture is heterogeneous. So, there's nothing we can do about that. Once we've decided to use visual culture as part of history, we have to accept it and find ways of dealing with it, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. But the other bit of the panel is modern history, and I have to say the one thing that has really struck me about this conference is that there are probably more views of the nature of modernity than there are participants in the conference, and that people have not been very specific about what they mean by modernity. And my dinner time conversation last night suggested to me that there are quite a lot of stakes in the nature of modernity, which people find it quite difficult to articulate, and I'm very sympathetic to that, and I hope my dinner companions don't mind if I refer to the very animated conversation that we had last night. So, for me, one way forward has to be to say, why are we so interested in modernity, and is it a useful concept? And how are we going to use it? And I accept that there won't be any one answer to that, but I think it is incumbent upon us to say something about it. I also think it's incumbent upon us to have some engagement with what I would call structural elements. So modernity can't just be a cultural phenomenon, it seems to me. It's got to be a phenomenon where there are coherent links between economic formations, the nature of the state, political activity, and so on. And I feel pretty unrepentant about that. I do not think we should do cultural history which does not engage with those sorts of issues in some way. So I guess I'd like to see cultural history link itself, even if in complex ways, with other aspects of history. And I think this is connected with something I said yesterday, which is, I think academic specialization has many costs. And I think we're all so keen on having our own little patch that we often don't see what the cost of having that patch is to some more generous understanding of the past. That's the first overall comment I want to make. Now, it follows from that, I think, that we have to have some coherent methodological principles. And I'm not suggesting that everyone has to share these principles, but what I am suggesting is that we have to be able to articulate them so that we can debate them. And so the next set of remarks is simply going to be some of my thoughts about that. Now, my first thought about that is that it seems to me that there is a notion that defines what a historical approach would be, and that's the idea of context. Now, context isn't background, but it's not much better in a certain sense, in that it's jolly difficult to say what we mean by context. But I think it's pretty clear that whatever it is we mean by context, that's what history does. So the discussion, it seems to me, has to keep refreshing the question of what we mean by context, and I think that's partly a question about the range of historical sources that we use. And furthermore, I think that the only way of thinking about those kinds of sources must be by some appeal to theme. Because if you appeal to something like genre or medium, you precisely reproduce these kind of fragmentary approach to history. So it seems to me that, to sort of cut a very long story short, as it were, that a thematic approach is entailed by all the other things that I've said so far. Okay, now, I think to do this properly, we need to make another and slightly different move. And it's a move that I think is connected with the comments that Tim just made. And it's about the nature of scholarly traditions. So in this room, there are many different scholarly traditions, and I think that it's part of being a historian that one has an understanding of one's scholarly traditions and how they relate to other people's scholarly traditions. And I think in training graduate students, which a lot of us spend most of our time doing, and that for me, that's a very important question. So I'd like to see us be as explicit as possible about these different scholarly traditions. And I think that would include an analysis of what is now called public history in the USA and increasingly in the UK. I'm not sure to what extent you would use this notion in Italy. But for example, the film we just saw was for me a piece of public history, and that's quite analytically distinct from the way in which, for instance, Vanessa used film yesterday in her talk. So what I'm suggesting is that that awareness of an engagement with a range of scholarly traditions is part of the kind of methodological precision that I'd like to see further developed. Okay. Now, I'd like to suggest that an example of how to be methodologically precise might be to do the following experiment. Let's start with people. Let's start with people in, I don't think it matters, 1850. Let's start with people in 1900. Let's start with people in 1910. What sort of a visual field was available to them? And I think that's a very different way of starting than most people have used here. And one of the advantages of doing that is it precisely overcomes these divisions between media, which seem to me to be both important and artificial. And what I'd like to suggest is that people's visual fields have always been very complex and heterogeneous, and that part of our responsibility as historians is to try and reconstruct the nature of those visual fields. And I want to suggest that the metaphor of translation. It's not a very good metaphor, but it's the best I can come up with in the circumstances. So what we are doing when we look at a photograph and then we look at, let's say, the Illustrated London News, and then turn to, I don't know, an engraved book illustration, is one is making constant mental translations between different forms. Just put it no more precisely than that. And I think that for me, begins to get to the heart of why we talk about visual culture. I think we talk about visual culture because we're interested in the nature of those translations and what they mean. And I think, as I was saying at coffee time, that the notion of conversation is one way of thinking about these things. Again, it's not maybe as analytically tough as it might be, but the fact is there are constant conversations between media and genre and so on. And we have to have some notions that we start with that are dynamic rather than passive. Okay, now what follows from me from that then is that there is no part of the life history of objects and images which is excluded. In other words, precisely how the image is made and its context, however that's going to be defined, are within the same analytical zone. So I'm just as interested in print techniques as I am in audiences. And I think those have to always be held together in the historian's mind, if that makes sense. So I don't want there to be people who know about print technique and different people who look at audiences, because it seems to me that defeats the object of the exercise. We can't say being interested in framing or in dealers is the role of this group of people, and being interested in, I don't know, film audiences is that group of people. We have to find ways of holding those diverse questions together in one person's mind. Nearly finished. What then follows for me from that is that I was very struck by what Ilaria said about comparison. It seems to me these are fundamentally comparative projects. They're comparative conventionally in the sense of taking a situation and putting stress on it by thinking about other situations. But they're comparative much more also in the sense in which literature is comparative. And I think it's very interesting that the biggest comparative field now, I think it's right. The biggest comparative field now is comparative literature. And I think that's very, very interesting. And I actually, what I suggest in my book is that maybe we should learn something from comparative literature. So comparative literature doesn't just say there's the French novel and the Russian novel and we're going to study them in comparison. It does a whole set of other operations that are much more broadly defined. So I think we ought to think more about forms of comparative reasoning. So I'm very interested in the nature of historical reasoning. And this could go off into a long disquisition, but I won't do that, which is about evidence. So I suppose one of the issues, I think, at the conference has been what counts as evidence and what we do with it. But anyway, be assured I won't go down that route. So my conclusion is this. That I think we're in a completely paradoxical situation. I would like to suggest that in the future conferences like this wouldn't be needed because historians would have been persuaded of the kind of arguments that we've made. And I think that's great. I think one doesn't have to perpetuate one's insight. If it's a good insight, it will be taken up and you can move on and have another insight. At the same time, it's absolutely clear to me that there are certain kinds of attention that working with visual sources demands, and that the skills that underlie that kind of attention have to be perpetuated. Now that may be quite compatible with never having another conference like this, as delightful as it may be. We could have a conference about the sound of the past, for example, or something like that. So I want to hold that idea that historical practice moves on, that the arguments we've made, if they're persuasive, will become integrated into historical practice. But that nonetheless, the kind of evidence that historians use require conscious and perpetually refined forms of attention in order to keep our concentration and focus fresh. So it seems to me it's that sense of freshness, of excitement, and hopefully we'll never ever lose that.
Merita un applauso. Grazie a Ludmilla di averci ricordato che appunto anche il tema del nostro convegno è lo sguardo, e di aver detto molto meglio di come l'ho detto io, ma appunto era un po' anche la mia intenzione di farlo, quello che accennavo nel commento della prima sessione del convegno, cioè questa necessità, come dire, di tenere insieme i diversi piani del discorso, no? E quindi il discorso delle specificità dei media su cui ci induceva a ragionare Alberto, e il discorso della visione dello sguardo. Questa è una scommessa ovviamente molto molto grossa. L'ultima a parlare almeno in questo primo giro, Vanessa Schwartz.
So before I make my final comments, I think it's important for us, given that it's been 2.5 days of extremely busy exchange, to acknowledge and thank the translators who have been invisible and in the box. Has been facilitated by their good work and their quickness, and it's a remarkable accomplishment. And it does relate in some ways to the issue of the insufficiency of verbal expression and the universality, potentially, of visual expression, which is one of the things that I want to try to begin to at least mention. So Ludmilla's comments ended that we could have a conference on sound, and I think then it would be fair to say, and I've always felt, that we were historians of the senses. And this is something that Alain Corbin has long been interested in, although I always felt he was a nostalgic who was only interested in the worlds that we had lost, the senses that we had lost. But this idea that we're doing sensory history, and or history of perception, and we are, in some measure, those charged with the visual, and therefore we engage in something that we could think of as historiophagy, which is what Hayden White wrote about, I guess 20 years ago, in the American Historical Review. And Gian Piero's film is that kind of imagistic historiography, historiophagy, which is of course what Benjamin also was kind of obsessed with trying to create. So to kind of, and I don't want to use this moment to respond simply, but to put on the table at least 2 issues about Benjamin that I think that Tim raised, and that I suppose I would also, we have the same metre, but we see him slightly differently, because I think you're right that he was insufficient in his fixation on the image, or in his ability to work the image, but I think it's because Benjamin went beyond the image and led us to the department store, to the train station, to the exposition, that he already understood long before Debord, that the world was an image, and that the forms of the modern world were expressing themselves, kind of in taking the power of the image and three-dimensionalizing it in ways that perhaps are most perfect or frightening in Disneyland. And so I think that this is something that is important for us as we think of Benjamin, and that ultimately he was a bad Marxist too. So in many of his exchanges with Adorno, I was always struck by how disrespectful and unpleasant Adorno was to him. And I think that's in part because Adorno understood that Benjamin was a bit of a bourgeois. He liked the snow globes that he talked about. And ultimately, I think that was good. Because in Benjamin, I think, are the hidden seeds of a kind of liberal humanism whose need, his own need for universalism in the time of his own life was a matter of survival as someone, as the different and the other. And so he saw this liberal humanism, I think, or we can see in him a seed of liberal humanism. And that brings me back to the idea of the universalism of the image. So then the question is, I think, ultimately this question of the spectacle and the gaze calls into question the possible and proper connection between the social and the individual as posed as either the subjective or the psychological, which I think in some ways Ludmilla's point about the structural, I actually am also invoking in that connection. But that gets us to, well, what's the container of history? In other words, the nation. And many of the presentations, I would say, invoked or fell back upon the idea that what we can explain is the nation. And I've never explained the nation. Luckily, I worked on the nation that considers itself universal, so that was always easy to get away with. But seriously, I think that we want to get beyond. And that's the problem with the comparison. Comparisons often in history end up being comparisons between nations. And I would really then ask us as a group to move beyond the nation as that which is compared. And in fact, I would ask us to move beyond the comparison and instead look at what I think nicely in French is called the axe croisé, the kind of the transnational, or the transmedial. And I think that, therefore, I think invokes or takes up the invitation to comparison, but without reconfiguring and reifying the containers, because our objects are pushing us beyond the containers that national history kind of was born from, and that political history was born from. And cultural historians and visual historians need, I think, to precisely readdress those containers in order to really make our, I think, biggest contributions. I think Ludmilla is absolutely right, and I had a whole bunch of stuff about modernity and what is modernity, because we didn't, very few people really tried to say what it was. And I do think that we need to talk about what is driving our moment, what is the change or the changes we are looking at. For me, capitalist aesthetics are at the core. They are remade by technology and mobility. So someone said, maybe I'm a technological determinist about their own work, and I agree. By which I mean that we make of the world, and Marx, told us this, what we inherit in some measure, and that is made possible by certain, I think, really important concrete things, such as technology. Another point I then want to kind of invoke is this idea of temporality. Tim spoke very eloquently about retrospection and nostalgia, and then Ludmilla about periodization. And I think there, too, we have to ask, what are the moments of our rupture? When do things change? Is it something like the cinema in 1895, or lithography, or photography? Are those the moments for us, for this group? We can, in fact, define our own fundamental watersheds, and I think we need to do that. Is there a difference between the 19th century and the 20th century? Do wars function for us as moments of rupture the way they do for political historians? So these are some of the questions that I think really will allow us to kind of write our own histories. Finally, some just really en passant, I think that the question is, we haven't spoken enough of the image as a form of communication and as a message rather than the container of meaning. We have a kind of way in which we take the image to be the frame and then read the meaning off of it, but really if we thought of them more dynamically, and I think, Barthes was very good on this, and so was all the people working in communication, if we think of them as messages, would we get something different? And this leads me to, I was glad to see Warburg invoked. I think that's excellent. I think he actually, in some ways, thought in those terms. And I'd also like to put on the table Grigori Kepes, who is a Hungarian, who some of you may or may not know, K-E-P-E-S. I think he's a kind of, you could say, a perceptual psychologist, would be a flat way of describing him. But I believe that actually for us, these folks, Arnheim, Kepes, the field of perceptual psychology will be the place to go from Benjamin. And I myself have been going there and found it unbelievably interesting and unresolved and, but useful, especially because all of these folks understood and were perceiving the visual in light of mobility, not only the mobility of the image, but the geographic mobility which has led to the world in which we live, in which we literally move, in which the global has come to be the defining kind of term of the contemporary world. And so one final then comment about that globalness, which is the strange ghosts of the conference, and it just may be, again, I don't think it's explicit, but I think it's interesting that we had America sat this morning and the UNRRA yesterday, but the absence of the United States of America in a conference about spectacle and the society of the spectacle is, something we all need to think a little bit more about and invoke and make sure that that global culture of visuality is part of the conversation. I am the last person to care about America. I don't study America. But the bottom line is, it's striking when you come from there and you go elsewhere, that you'd be very shocked, the Americans would be shocked to learn that they kind of didn't exist here. And I know that that's a form of, look, it also is the dying empire, so it's worth at least invoking. And I think there to also remember the kind of Asia, South Asia, and Latin America in our kind of global meanderings, because these are these future ways of connecting, which is why I found the institutional museum histories, the Greek and the Turkish papers, so important, because they brought those questions of connecting Europe and where does Europe begin and where does Europe end to us. And then finally, my last point about this kind of intermediality. This is not new. There has always been intermediality. But I guess the question is the fundamental impact of modernity and its great achievement the constant putting into play, the understanding and awareness of intermediality. So if it always was there, I think modernity's achievement is to make it apparent as opposed to buried. And that's something that we're dealing with, which is why you get comments or phrases like visual culture making so much sense now. So that's all I have to say.
Grazie anche a Vanessa per aver messo ulteriori temi e terreni sul piatto. Sono davvero tante le suggestioni, i suggerimenti, le sollecitazioni che ci sono venute. Non so se vogliamo, se volete voi eventualmente intervenire con qualche domanda a qualcuno dei partecipanti o anche i diversi partecipanti alla tavola rotonda ritornare su alcuni punti. Non so, chiedo un po' a voi. Tanto vediamo. Troppo. Simo.
Visto che